A Flash in the Dark, Chapter 8, Powers. Iris drove Barry to the precinct, unable to keep the smile off her face. It took barely 10 minutes to get there, and Iris grinned a bit wider as she opened the door for Barry. The receptionist, a woman by the name of Georgia, looked up and grinned wide. "Oh my gosh, Barry, you're all right!" the older woman said, practically bouncing to her feet. Barry smiled as the receptionist raced around her desk and hugged her. Georgia grinned as she pulled back. "Do the others know?" she asked, a gleam of mischief in her eyes. Barry shook her head. "Not yet," Barry admitted. Georgia grinned and motioned for Barry to stay put as she went over to the glass doors that led to the officers' desks. She knocked loudly and cleared her throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have a visitor," Georgia said, causing most everyone to pause. Barry held in a giggle as several of the officers stood looking confused. Joe stepped forward and raised an eyebrow.
"Georgia, what are you talking about?"
Joe asked, raising an eyebrow. Georgia's smile widened further as she brushed a lock of red hair behind her ear. "Why don't I let her explain?" Georgia stepped aside, and Barry stepped into the open door with a grin. "Hi, Joe," Barry said, her voice catching in her throat. Joe blinked a few times before quick stepping forward and wrapping Barry in a hug. The whole precinct burst into applause as Barry hugged her foster father back. Soon the applause had died down.
"Oh, you scared the hell out of me, kiddo,"
Joe said, ruffling Barry's hair as he pulled back slightly. Barry grinned as Joe let go and smiled at her. One of the other officers grinned and patted her on the arm. "Yeah, that was some nap you took there, babyface. And you still look 12, Vukovich said, patting her on the shoulder. Barry shook her head slightly, a grin on her face. One of the female officers, Fiona, walked up to them. "Sorry to interrupt, Joe, but we got a 1082 in progress at Gold City Bank. Storm's really picking up on the south side. I'd grab your rain gear." "Good to see you, Barry," Fiona said, handing Joe a file. Barry nodded and turned to Joe, who was holstering his weapon. "Do you want me to come with?" Barry asked, shoving her hands in her pockets. Joe shook his head and waved a finger at Barry. "No, there'll be plenty for you to do once you settle down. Come on, partner." Joe called across the bullpen. Barry turned, expecting to see Shire, but instead, Eddie Thon stepped forward, holstering his gun. "It's good to see you, Allen," Eddie said, holstering his sidearm. Barry smiled slightly. Iris seemed to be a little off. "You should get going. My dad doesn't like to be kept waiting," she said, folding her arms. Eddie nodded slightly, looking down as if avoiding Iris's eyes before he left. Barry frowned and turned around, looking for Shire. On the wall of the precinct were photos of fallen officers. There was a new one. Shire's photo had a plaque that read "Gone but never forgotten." Barry felt tears build in her eyes. Iris laid a hand on Barry's shoulder. "The night the accelerator exploded, Clyde Martin shot and killed Shire. The Martin brothers' plane went down in the storm," Iris explained. Barry squeezed Iris's hand. One of the officers waved Iris over, and another, who was in the process of arresting a scruffy-looking man, nodded at Barry. "It's good to have you back, Barry," one of them called. Barry smiled and then noticed the man reaching for the officer's gun. In seconds, she was across the room, slamming him down into the table to prevent him from hurting anyone. Then, before she knew what was happening, she was back across the room where she'd originally been standing. She blinked and looked down at her hand, which seemed to be vibrating. She grabbed it and tried to steady it, but it just seemed to get faster. Iris put a hand on Barry's shoulder. "You all right?" Iris asked. Barry nodded and forced a smile. "Fine, I just need some air. I'll call you tomorrow." Barry left before Iris could say anything. She looked down at her hand, which was vibrating so much it was blurring at the edges. She felt her heartbeat speed up. "What's happening to me?" She tried to walk forward and ended up slamming into the police cruisers, shattering the back window. She stumbled back from it and ran down the alleyway, accidentally slamming into several large bags of laundry in the back of the van. She made her excuses to the confused man who was moving laundry bags and caught a cab back to Star Labs. Cisco raised an eyebrow as the beeping that indicated the presence of someone in the elevator went off. He flipped on the computer and pulled up the video feed. Standing in the elevator was Barry Allen, shaking slightly, looking scared and confused. Cisco pushed the intercom. "Dr. Wells, you were right. She's back, heading up the elevator now," Cisco called. The voice of Dr. Wells came through the intercom. Thank you, Cisco. Find Caitlin, if you would please. I'll meet Miss Allen at the elevators. Wells assured. Cisco nodded and raced off. Wells reached the elevators as they opened and revealed a rather freaked out Barry Allen, shaking from head to toe. No, not shaking, vibrating. It took a few minutes, but he managed to calm her down and get her to stop shaking, but not before she explained, rather quickly, what had happened to her. It took quite a bit of Wells's self-restraint not to smile even a little. Things were all falling into place just as he'd planned. After explaining the situation to an embarrassingly excited Cisco and a skeptical Caitlin, they loaded up into one of the mobile lab vans and set out for the now-abandoned Ferris Air testing track just outside of Central. Barry frowned. Wait, when did Ferris Air go out of business? She asked, her attention pulled away from the iPad in front of her. Cisco unwrapped another lollipop and looked out the window. Caitlin was driving the large RV-like vehicle, and Dr. Wells was sitting next to her in a repurposed passenger seat that strapped in his wheelchair. One of their test pilots went missing on a training exercise, Cisco explained around his candy. Barry frowned, looking worried. Do you know which pilot? Barry asked, setting down the iPad. Cisco shrugged and shook his head and fiddled with a small piece of machinery. Not off the top of my head. Sorry, he said, glancing back at Barry. Dr. Wells spoke up. It was a man by the name Hal Jordan. He went missing about 3 months ago. They launched an investigation and found the plane he was in crashed in the Badlands, but there was no sign of him. Wells explained. Barry gasped and tears welled up in her eyes. Hal? She choked out, her hands beginning to shake, to vibrate. Cisco frowned down at his machinery as her vitals went nuts. Did you know him? Cisco asked. Barry nodded. He was an old friend of mine. We met in college. He was going for his pilot's license, and I was going for a criminal science degree. He needed a tutor for his English Lit required course. My professor recommended me. We didn't really hit it off at first, but then he showed up to his tutoring session with pizza, and we bonded over crushed dreams and some other stuff. He used to claim he wouldn't have gotten his degree without me. Barry smiled through her tears. We kept in contact for a while after we graduated, but we sort of dropped off each other's radar after a few years. I ran into him again a few days before the lightning. We promised to keep in touch. Barry bit back a sob. Cisco reached out and patted her back. She tried not to cry, but she couldn't help it. It was just too much. She just hoped nothing had happened to Oliver. She hadn't had time to check, and she'd left her purse at Star Labs. Cisco reached into the small backpack he'd brought with him and rummaged for a moment before pulling out a chocolate bar. Here, he offered a bit awkwardly. Barry smiled up at him and took the chocolate. It was nice that he seemed to genuinely care.